Hi there, my name is Shade Whitesel and I'm going to be talking about location and arousal specific marker cues, which is basically taking your reinforcement procedures, taking your different ones and chopping up that clicker. So a little bit about me before we get started. I'm an FDSA instructor these days. I also do teach some seminars kind of post-COVID. Competition-wise, I mostly am in Schutzen and AKC. And a little bit of dabbling in French ring. That means that I really like the high drive dogs, the highly motivated toy dogs that like to bite things and are really active. And so I've kind of specialized in teaching people how to channel that drive for bitey stuff, that drive for tugging and chasing into toy play, and how to use that to reinforce behaviors that we want out of our dogs. My secret love too is foundation skills. I really like introducing people to those foundation concepts, and I enjoy teaching that stuff. Before all this online stuff, I taught pet manners and behavior modification for over 20 years in my tiny little rural town. And then breed-wise, these days I have German Shepherds. I've also had a couple mixes and a Malinois. So before we get started, let's start with some definitions. We've got what I call behavior cue versus a marker or reinforcement cue. And then we're going to be talking about what a clicker is, traditional use of a clicker, and then how that differs from like a location arousal specific marker cue, which I'll be talking about for the majority. So they're all cues. They're cues to do something. They're all cues to do an action, whether that action is sitting, putting your butt on the ground, or chasing a tossed treat. So they're all cues, but for the purposes of this presentation, it is useful to separate cues into behavior cues, what I call behavior cues, and also reinforcement cues. Okay, so reinforcement cues lead to primary reinforcement. So in this case, we're mostly going to be talking about we're mostly going to be talking about treats or chasing and tugging, toy stuff. So a reinforcement cue, marker cue might be toss, which would be a cue to chase a toss treat and eat the food. Versus a behavior cue, which would be sit, put your butt on the ground, which leads to toss, to eat the food. Okay, so behavior cues are, let's do sit, heeling, stuff that we've taught. It could be agility, it could be jumping over a jump, going through a tunnel. And then marker cues, reinforcement cues are collect the primary reinforcement. Marker cues often, always for me, also function as a release cue. Dog can stop doing the behavior that we marked and concentrate fully on collecting the reinforcement. Another way to put it is that you use reinforcement cues to help teach other behaviors, okay, which is easier than using sit or heeling to teach other behaviors, even though, of course, it can be done, and when you start chaining stuff, it does reinforce the cue before it. But I generally wouldn't use sit, the opportunity to sit, to teach other behaviors. I would use treats or something the dog usually finds a little more reinforcing. Okay, so what do we mean when we talk about clicker? Often, so there's many different things we can call a clicker. Event, according to what camp you're coming from, event marker, secondary reinforcer, release cue, collect reinforcement cue, that's kind of my favorite. And it can be like a whistle, if you've got marine mammals, click from the clicker, a yes, a lot of people use yes as the general marker. So why don't you think of the clicker or yes as what I call general marker? And of course, it marks the behavior the learner was doing. And normally, it cues the dog to orientate to the handler's body language to see where and what reinforcement, okay? Okay, so you're cueing the clicker, you say yes or you click, and normally that cues the dog to orientate to your body language to see what they're getting, okay? Or if you've done a couple reps before, and I know some people use the clicker where they kind of pattern where they're going to throw the food, then the dog understands that where the reinforcement is coming from and what they're getting has been patterned into the reps before. The clicker, or yes, usually functions as a cue to eat food. and as a look at the handler's body language and eat food where I'm told, or where that signifies. It's a little bit different from what I'm going to talk about today, which is location and arousal specific. Okay, so again, marks the behavior the learner is doing. That part doesn't change, but the dog knows exactly what, where, and how to collect the reinforcement from the verbal cue alone. It might be that the verbal cue directs them to look at your body language. So for instance, when I tell my dog to chase, I want them to look at my hand with the toy in it so they can see where the toy is going, or same with the toss treat. I want them looking at, I want to say toss, I want the dog looking at my hand to see where it goes. But they already know by the chase or the toss that I'm going to be throwing something, and so they already have that body language that anticipates where it's going to go, okay? Or you might say something that they don't have to. They know exactly where it is. They don't have to orientate to your body language. Like if it's in a dish behind them, you might just say dish, and then off they go and get it without you having to point or anything like that, okay? So just keep in your head, the dog knows exactly what, where, and how to collect reinforcement from the verbal cue alone. So take a look at this video. This is my friend Linda with her Malinois Tekin, and she's going to be showing us, I think, three different marker cues here. Actually 4. So that one, stay there. Basically, marker reinforcement cues are training specific reinforcement procedures and attaching different cues to those different procedures. You're taking advantage of that effect to teach and maintain behavior skills. I first learned about this from Sarah Keegan's of Posy Dog Learning Center in Columbus, Ohio, and a series of seminars from Fanny Gott, who is a dog trainer in Sweden. We're going to get back to that Tegan video, but that's just an example of those different things. So, reinforcement procedures. Reinforcement drives behavior. It's the most important part. Without your dog liking what you have, it's really hard to build behaviors without that reinforcement. And so early on, I realized that what happens after the click is just as important as during and before. How the dog keeps that, how the dog collects that reinforcement and keeps that training loop clean. It makes the communication clear by letting your learner know what and where they are getting the reinforcement. And honestly, it's kind of more complicated for us, but I think it makes it easier for the dog. Why are we calling them marker cues? They're first and foremost reinforcement cues, okay? And so I want you guys to keep in your head, they're basically cues that say eat food, chase this, chase it in this way, or move forward and take it from your hand. They're reinforcement cues. So specific things to think about as you're dividing that clicker up and teaching the different reinforcements. What is the reinforcement? Does your dog have a hierarchy of things it likes better than others? What action does the dog do between the mark and the reinforcement? Where is the reinforcement? Sort of the same thing as the action that the dog takes to get it. And then it is worth thinking about what excitement does the reinforcement make versus other reinforcements. And you can call those different things and then use that arousal and that excitement or the calmness depending on the behavior that you're building. So first, what is the reinforcement? It can be a treat, toy play, chase and tugging, sniffing, access to places, access to people or dogs the dog likes, actions the dog enjoys like swimming. Swimming or getting cool is something that I might use. So if your dog, most dogs have hierarchies of of things that they like better than others. So, or, you know, just the excitement of things rather than others. So I find it very useful to take these concepts and name these things, different verbal cues, so the dog knows exactly what they're getting. Next, I want you to think about, where does the dog collect reinforcement? What action does the dog perform? So you can see here in this picture, one is jumping forward to get the tug that I just tossed at him. So do they go forward? Do they turn around 180 degrees and chase something you threw? Do they run straight ahead without orientating to your body language? Do they strike the toy on the ground that they knew was there before or didn't know? You know, are you cueing them to go forward towards something that they might know? Do they walk one step to your hand to get a treat? That's different than running, okay? Do they orientate to the ground? If the treat's on the ground, are they chasing treats on the ground or sniffing treats on the ground? Those can be two separate things. Or do they stay there and receive the reinforcement as you bring it to them? Okay, so all these might be different reinforcement cues that you tell your dog, and they know instantly where to access their reinforcement. The what the dog gets and the how they get it will determine the energy and arousal that the marker cue conveys. Okay, so a good example would be a tossed treat that the dog has to chase is a much different energy than kind of reaching down and getting a treat on the ground. Or even if you want to take it further, chasing the toy, like chasing a ball that you just threw for 50 feet, is much different energy and arousal than sniffing a treat on the ground. So I want those two incredibly different things to be called different, to be associated in the dog's brain with different verbal cues, because when I'm building a behavior, for instance, if you think about downstay, I want relaxation in that downstay. I'm not going to be using chasing a toy to train the downstay, because I'm going to get a very different downstay. I'm going to get what I call an active downstay, which I also do teach in Schutzen for that tossed toy, versus relaxation that I might want. So I'm going to be building, I don't want the dog to get confused, so I'm going to be calling those reinforcement procedures very different things, and I think that helps me build my behaviors. So here's a couple examples, what reinforcement, and in the next video we'll see my Shepherd one showing food versus toy stuff. There is sniff, which is scatter treats on the ground, and you saw Tegan do that earlier. Toss, chase treat. X, move forward to take treat in the hand. I'm big on that one. I want the dog to get out of what behavior they were doing. Bit, strike toy in the hand, and bit with the bite pillow is just the most exciting thing he can have. So even though he'd like the toy and the toy's in sight, now you choked him. I'm cueing him to take the food there, not the toy. So this also goes into it in that the sight of the reinforcer. Here, sniff is not the cue to take the reinforcer. Same thing. This is the most exciting reward for you. Doesn't mean you can have it. Doesn't mean you can grab it on your way back, which you'd like to do. And now you can have it. Okay, so that gives you kind of a little tidbit of there, okay? Now, when you're training your marker cues, I want you to look for three things, and or think about three things. One, anticipatory body language between the verbal cue and the dog collecting the reinforcement. And that leads us into that there are two parts to each marker cue, the verbal cue and the presentation of the reinforcement. And then there's always that switching reinforcement at play here. You saw just right there. Onesie I'm cueing him to take food in a particular way, and he can't, I'm not cueing him to take the toy in front of his face, which is higher hierarchy in the reward system for him. But we're working on switching reinforcement. Take the reinforcement that I tell you that you're going to get. Okay. Clean training loops. This has to do with the anticipatory body language from the dog between the verbal cue and the collecting of the reinforcement. If you don't see this, your dog's not understanding the different locations, okay? So body language you may see out of the dog would be dancy feet, okay? So let's say you the dog sat and you're gonna say toss. You want to see the dog get up out of the sit and anticipate that it's going to be a high arousal reinforcer for him, okay? So dancy feet, jumping up, turning around, staying still, depending on what marker cue you're giving the dog. In order to get this, you need pre-loaded reinforcement, okay? I want the treat or the toy already in your hand. And most of the time you really already need it in your hand. And there's pros and cons to that. But you don't want to have to reach into your bait bag every single time in between you saying the marker cue and delivering it. Because then you'll get what I call junk behaviors, like staring at your hand or staring at the bait bag while you get treats out. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you want the dog to understand that there's going to be a toss treat versus treat in your hand, it's important that there be a clean loop between toss and then the treat is tossed versus X or yes, and the dog comes to your hand, okay? If you don't see that anticipatory body language that is different with different marker cues, then either your timing is off and the verbal cue is not relevant to the dog, or you've got some sort of loading behavior in between and you're making it more complicated for your dog than it needs to be, in which case, if that's the way you want to train, reaching into the bait bag and not having treats in your hand, again, nothing wrong with it. It's just that in that case, you should likely use a general marker and stick with it that way, okay? So back to this video of Tegan, I want you to see the anticipatory body language she does in between the verbal cue and the treats actually hitting her mouth. So she really understands the difference between those two. You can see she gets ready for the toss treat. She gets up out of her Linda has excellent mechanics right there, so that you can really see the different actions that Tegan is doing, because all those words mean something different to her. Okay, so what did she tell us? Face, the treat coming down to her, stays in position. Yes, she moved forward to the hand immediately. Search, which is her toss treat, jumps up, moves backwards. In anticipation, she got all stocky. Scatter, she got up again, but she moved forward and started orienting to the ground, okay? And if you really start to analyze that body language, the dog actually has different energy levels in that, and we would use each one of those marker cues to teach different behaviors depending on what we wanted out of the dog. So, second concept, there's two parts to the reinforcement process. There's a sound that marks the behavior, so marks what you're telling the dog to do, and then the presentation of the reinforcement. So the dog knows where the presentation is and goes straight there. But they still have to wait for it, okay? That's something that I think is getting a little bit lost nowadays. So if you think about the reinforcement presentation, let's say my cue for this is X, where the dog's going to get it from my hand. X, I would say X, and I open the palm of my hand to let the dog access the treat. Dog isn't allowed to just grab my hand. They have to wait for my palm to open to dispense the treat to them, okay? With a toss treat, so toss, The dog has to track the hand, know where the treat is going, and wait for the treat to leave the hand. Again, they kind of have to wait for the presentation, which in the toss, treat, and the chase is basically tracking the hand and watching where the toy or the treat is going. If you've got a toy and you're telling the dog to strike the toy from your hands, you have to present a target of the toy free of body parts and your hands on the edges with a firm surface or a surface for the dog's mouth to fit at. And the dog has to wait for hands to not be in the way and not bite the flesh when targeting toys, okay? So all of this goes into the teaching. You've got to teach baby puppies how to take food from your hand and not just grab it out. So it's the same sort of thing, but it becomes a little more obvious when you've got things like chase, the difference between chase and strike when you've got more high exciting toys, things like that. So here's my dog Reiki giving us a example of him waiting and how the different presentations of strike and chase are. So he had to wait for me to put it to the side there.
Check.
Okay, so those are just a couple examples of how, one, the dog is showing anticipatory body language, and two, he's waiting for the presentation. Okay, so the switching reinforcement part. Basically, again, a trained thing. Take the reinforcement I want you to. There's several different things you can do with this. It's transfer of value. If you've got one reinforcer that's not as reinforcing as another, or a behavior that's not as reinforcing, you can play around with that. Play around with the arousal up and down between different marker cues. Also playing around with the association. If you think back to the video of ones between the bite, pillow, and food, a lot of times we create the association that the dog expects a thing in sight, and I want the dog to always be listening, and I want to be variable about that. I don't want the thing that is in sight to cue the dog that they're going to get that reinforcer. This also brings up a concept for me. I really feel like teaching the dog the switching reinforcement concept is our positive trainers know. So kind of, again, thinking about that one's video, when I'm saying X, I'm saying food is available, but I'm also saying bite pillow is not available. And I think this transfers or translates easier to a dog who understands that when they see deer, they're not supposed to, when they see deer, which would be a higher value than treats, but you're cueing treats, they understand that the treats are available and the deer isn't, okay? So if they grow up with this kind of concept and it's a taught behavior for them, things like deer versus cookie are much easier for them to figure out and perform. Excuse me. So what is the point of all this talk about reinforcement? How does it apply to our training? We're going to talk about how we're going to use it in obedience skills, specifically for this conference. And a couple things I'm going to cover. It evaluates the mindset of the dog you have. Clarity and reinforcement communication, we've already talked a lot about that. Placement of reward while teaching and while maintaining behaviors. That's a kind of really important thing for me when I'm teaching my behaviors. And then the emotion of the specific marker cue is retained in the emotion of the behavior that you use to teach it. Okay, so evaluate mindset. Can you hear your reinforcement cues? That's a question that I like to ask my dog. I want to evaluate that the listening from the dog. I go to a new location and I want to actually ask them, do you understand the difference between toss and X and sniff? Are you performing those behaviors quick? And I want to ask them those questions before I ask them something complicated like heel or retrieve, because if they can't hear the marker cues that are supposedly easier and more fluent, then I'm not going to ask them to heel. So I like asking my dog things like this around new locations, new triggers, new pressure things like people, objects, all those distraction things that we want eventually for our dogs to trial among. So here is a protocol that I have, and I've got other webinars on this, but basically I'm working my young shepherd Talik through some distractions, and I'm asking him, can you hear your reinforcement cues? And this is a busy park with the distractions on 3 sides of us. So he glanced away, and I'm going to repeat it because he showed me that he could hear it, but it was hard for him. Again with the glances. And we all make mistakes. I forget. I'm like, huh? So I went back to the beginning. Okay, so if you think about the video you just saw, in the beginning, Talik was taking the food, but he was glancing around, even barked at one time. I'm not going to ask that dog right there to work. Okay, I'm not going to ask him to heel, because if they can't take the food and orientate right back to me, then they're telling me that that location at that time is a little much. Okay, then in the middle, he got good. He was coming straight back. He was fast. He was looking at me very, very quickly. And that's when I said in the text, now I've got more brain to work with. And that's the dog that I would ask to work and do behaviors. Okay. So that the dog that just told me, oh, this is easy. I can do this. And you know, the environment's not a big deal. But then I made the mistake of asking my young dog to down, which he may not know it at that time enough on verbal. Or it could be that he's still not ready to do a hard behavior, vulnerable behavior like down. So I kind of made that mistake and had to re-cue that down, and then I lost him again. Okay. So that's really important to me, to ask my dog, can you hear your marker cues, and to really reevaluate that, that place and time between when they get the treat to when they're orientating to me. And can you tell the difference between your different marker cues? Okay, next concept. Clarity in reinforcement communication. Dog gets what you say they get, not what they think. And I think, one, by using a lot of specific types of reinforcement, that's a really important skill for our dog to understand. And I do think it splits down the skill of working around all distractions when you're working around the sight of something as a distraction for something else. So it splits down the skill of working around all those distractions. And also, when you're very clear about what the dog is getting, it avoids disappointment and tricking of your dog. Some dogs care more about this than others. Some dogs don't care at all. Oh, I thought I was getting the tug. I got the treat instead. Oh, that's fine. Some dogs really care and get disappointed. And my aim when training my dogs is to be as clear and as fair as possible. Okay, so kind of taking that concept and exploring it further, take what I tell you, not what you want. It really makes me, it doesn't make me. I really want to train the thinking dog. I don't want to train the anticipating dog, the dog that's kind of just rote doing things. I really want to keep my dog I want to keep my training variable, flexible, and I want my dog in that thinking state of mind, really paying attention to me very hard, instead of anticipating and knowing what's coming next. And because our skills and our obedience skills often are patterns, I think this is really important, especially with the, clever dogs that really want to kind of figure out what's next. I don't find that's helpful in my training. It's more important to have some variability and flexibility and have the dog going, what is next? Okay. And I think that playing around with different reinforcements in spite of what the dog thinks they're getting is important for keeping that state of mind. Also, because we have preloaded hands, preloaded treats, preloaded toy in order to get those really clean training loops, I think it's really important that the site of the reinforcement doesn't become the antecedent for your behavior skill that you're teaching, okay? And then again, with the positive trainers, no. Again, take what I tell you, not what you want. Sometimes when we're working a dog through, okay, even in spite of the toy that you see, I want you to take food, I'll get people saying, but the food's not reinforcing at that point. So why would I reinforce with the food? Well, sometimes you don't get what you think you do, and it's not that both of them are available, it's that the site of the reinforcer doesn't mean you get it, okay? So X means food, not toy, and I think this is helpful when you're working through some of those distractions where the dogs, you've already taught the concept. If the dog sees a toy, wants a toy, and instead understands that they have to listen, and get food, maybe instead of the toy, then I also think they have the concept when you're working on other distractions later, like don't take that jump, go past it to the send out spot, or don't greet the judge when the judge comes near me, things like that. I think it helps them split down those distractions. So kind of along the same vein, we're cueing the toss treat. And so the dog still gets the toss treat and the food on the ground, versus when we don't cue that stuff and we don't work through that, then I think it's harder for the dog to have control over food on the ground. When we train, so kind of where my mind's going with this is I train with a lot of traditional trainers who don't want to feed their dog on the ground ever, because they don't want the dog to understand that there is food to be had on the ground because of sniffing and things like that. And I throw a lot of food and my dog doesn't sniff. And I feel like because he knows that he can find food when I cue it, he's not desperate to find food otherwise. Also, if I can teach him control around food in a dish or toss treat, I think that also helps teach the dog control around other delicious things, smells, where other dogs have been, other people's treats that were there before, leftover treats. I think that by teaching him when he can get the reinforcement and all the different ways, I think that helps because I can control that. I can control the food in the dish and access to that. And I think that, again, has that concept of then he can control himself around other delicious things that he'll encounter oftentimes in any other location. It also, if you cue the reinforcement and you've taught the dog this kind of stuff, we're on a reinforcement teaching rather than breaks. Okay, so I'm not stopping the dog from access, but I'm rather working on the self-control and the anticipation and the, can I have it, Mom? Can I have it now? Instead of me trying to stop the dog from accessing the reinforcement. Okay, so I think all that stuff really, really is helpful. And I do think that the location marker cues are really helpful about teaching the dog these concepts. Avoiding disappointment. For my dogs, it's really important for me to avoid disappointment. I have highly motivated dogs that use their teeth when they're frustrated and use their teeth when they're disappointed or feel tricked. And I've had several humbling reminders of this, usually in trial. So I really like the clarity of the dog understanding exactly what they're getting and knowing what they're getting and not being disappointed when they want the thing that they see in sight and they get the other thing instead. I've seen many, many examples of people who use a general marker cue and they want to reinforce the dog with something, and the dog wanted the thing that they didn't get reinforced with, and then all your clever timing kind of goes out the window. So I do think that while, we still got to be fair and make sure that the dog, we're teaching in a way that the dog is getting reinforced by what they want and find reinforcing. I think that with different reinforcement cues, we can kind of help we can help avoid some of the disappointment that our dogs might have. Okay, so this one is really important to me. Placement of reward. It should be reinforcement, but we always call it placement of reward. When you're building behaviors. So this is just an example of different kinds of reward while you're teaching stuff. He sniffs the treats right there. Good, I want a clean loop, so he does the behavior. Okay, so placement of reward in this case is you do your indication, you come back to my hand in spite of me being lazy and having the jar of treats right there. So, think about your placement of reward for all the things in obedience you're going to teach. The biggest reward placement thing that when I did this on the Academy list, I got a lot of this, and this is definitely where I use a lot of placement of reward, different marker cues. It's specific to healing, teaching healing, and I think that healing is such a complicated behavior for both human and dog that we end up not being as precise in our criteria as we could be, so we end up doing a lot of placement of reward to get what we want in healing and then to combat and maintain it. I find there's a lot of maintenance involved in keeping and attaining the good healing that you taught in the first place. So specific to healing, think about a marker cue that means to the dog go behind you or turn to the left to combat some of that foraging. Maybe you have a dog that's not as enthused about healing. Well, I might do a more exciting marker cue like jumping up. If I want to calm the dog, that's when I might feed in position when I want to calm the dog. So always in healing, I'm thinking about, do I want to calm the dog down? Do I want more precise healing, calmer? Or do I want more excitement and more motivation out of this dog? So I'm always looking at that and doing my different marker cues in healing to reflect that. I also want different marker cues because I don't want the dog looking at my hands and healing. So I have a lot of verbal cues, again, with that listening brain. I want them listening. And I don't want them looking at my hands to figure out where the reward is. Also, think about your other behaviors. You've got go outs, you've got stays, all the things basically. And that scent discrimination I was just doing with ones. I want a really clean loop between your indication and coming back. And also, usually, I'm thinking about what's going to be in the end trial skill, and also thinking about how to pattern that. Okay. So for stays, you might do stay there and receive reinforcement in place to kind of make more value of the dog staying there. Toy on ground, dish on ground can be really useful as well. Something that I use when I'm getting close to trialing would be jackpot, which is we both run to our reinforcement outside the ring. And it's not that I ever reward within the ring, but I want my dog to understand that outside the ring, after that behavior chain of a trial, it's important as well. And you still get rewarded. So here is once my dog healing, and just a way to, a marker cue that means jump up and get the treat or the toy near my armpit. And so this keeps the dog in line with the left side of your body. as far as like teaching the heel, and also keeps them excited and motivational, and thinking up thoughts. Healing, a lot of times when the dog gets really excited and healing, they tend to forge and go forward, and bounce is my way of combating that. I want the dog putting their energy up instead of out. So first I always teach the dog how to do it from moving backwards. That's how I teach healing. It's first in front of me. You can see he jumps up and gets it straight. So we're reinforcing along my left side, we're reinforcing straightness, and we're reinforcing putting your thoughts up. Here is tack, which is a reward or a placement of reward that I want the dog to duck behind me and get the reward out of my right hand. And here for onesie, I throw it to be more exciting. So he dips behind me out of heel and jumps to get it. But for most of my students and clients, I want them to just hold the like ball on a rope or tug still and tell the dog to get it. And what I find too is it's actually oftentimes easier for us to mark the good healing and not have to worry about the presenting the toy. So especially with toy dogs that are really find it really hard to think with the toy involved, this one combats the forging, but also it makes the dog more thoughtful in how to access the toy. And you can see how he just dips behind me and gets it out of my right. And that way it's also easy to hold this, to get the side of the toy out of your healing rather than if you have it in your left hand. Good boy. And there in AKC, hand position. I teach my dogs both hand positions. So you can see that one, it's still getting the bouncing, still getting really motivational, but between the one up in the armpit and the one ducking behind, if I keep those two, it also keeps him thinking of how to access his reward. Here's another example of Talic and send out. And in the AKC send out, we want the dog going to usually the baby gate or the side of the ring, whatever your ring looks like in your region. And here I'm just building the behavior of the send out. The first time I ever go nose touch that. And now cheep. Cheep means freeze, and I'll bring it to you. And then the behavior ends. And the same thing with no target. So even before I'm adding the sit in there, which is how it ends, here we go. And then cheep. I'm already building that behavior of going to something and turning around and not coming straight back to me. So while I'm building it, I'll definitely do some go out there and come back and go out there and come back. But with cheep, then I can get the dog to stay out there and kind of swing around in a really exciting way. And then it's pretty easy to add that sit in there. Okay, so the next concept to think about is building behaviors. I want you to think about the emotions and the expectations of your reinforcement. And that has to do with, is it very exciting? Is it really arousing to the dog? Or is it calm and relaxing? If you separate these emotions into separate marker cues, you can manipulate the behavior skills that you're teaching, the excitement or the calmness of the behavior skill you're teaching. Okay, so for instance, for me, I want healing to be very exciting and motivating for the dog. And normally I want my downstay to be relaxed and just not be in that seeking out food sort of association, just kind of relax. And then I'm going to show you a video of associations between toy and or food, a little skill there. So, oh yeah, this is the video. So this is kind of, let me back up for a sec. Okay, so you've got to separate the emotions while you're building the behaviors. Okay, but then as far as the food or toy refusal, I want the cue of what the dog thinks they're getting to be different than what they're getting. So in the exercise you're going to see, the dog is supposed to, I built an active stay. So it's not a downstay relaxation, but it's an active stay where he's expecting his toy and he's not expecting the food. And specifically, I teach the food cue to mean that he gets the tugging. So let's watch. So I've got a different expectation here. You're going to get hot dogs thrown at you, and you get toy. And you can see he's all active. Okay, so you can see how that goes. Now let's talk about what marker cues we actually have and what is useful. Your basically common marker cues are take from hand, move forward, take it from my hand, and toss treat. So I use those two to teach a lot of behaviors. Additional food cues can be sniff, scatter. You saw that with Tegan in the Mao. Dish, which would be a treat in the dish. Room service, or slow, I call it slow, would be stay in position and wait until I bring the treat to you. When you're thinking about your marker cues, think about these different positions, but also think about quantity of treats. Do you want many treats versus one? How you do the treats. Do you drop them versus place them? One way can be more exciting to the dog than the other way. So I want you to think of the action and the energy of the dog when you're thinking about naming different reinforcement procedures. Toy stuff, I want you to teach the toy play separately as reinforcement. A lot of times dogs like chasing, but in order to use it as reinforcement, you need to get the toy back. So that's a kind of taught separately kind of thing. But once you've got that taught, once you've got dogs bringing their toys back and giving them up without too much conflict, the two most useful and normal toy cues would be strike, which would be tugging, versus chase, where you throw and I do it. And I want, in the teaching of this, I want the presentations proofed so that the dog just doesn't grab your hands and the tug. And then, if you could chase, they wait until it leaves your hand. And again, that's a teaching thing, but once you get it, it's really awesome how your dog can figure that out. Additional toy marker cues might be different locations. If you find that it's important for you to have toy on the ground in different locations. I do a lot of chase when the dog is young, but I try to get away from that because chase is a young dog's game and I want to be easier on the body of my dog. So I do a lot of catch, and spike would be where I throw the toy against the ground and it kind of bounces and the dog can just strike forward and get it. It's a quick strike. And then if you're doing other things other than obedience, you might have cues that mean higher arousal stuff. So here is Courtney and Bee showing off all their toy marker cues.
Chase.
Whoop. Yeah. Whoop. Yeah. Catch. So such a good little video of all the different marker cues right there. Okay, so to summarize this presentation, I want you to think about the clarity of communication that you're having with your dog. I want you to think about placement and reward when you're teaching your behaviors. And I want you to think about there are two parts to the marker cue, verbal plus physical presentation. So I'm going to leave you with those thoughts. How to get more access to me. Shadesdogtraining.net is my website, and you'll see my list of seminars there, but mostly it can be found on Fenzi Dog Sports Academy. I teach 2 classes a term, and I do various webinars and workshops. Facebook, Shade Whitesel, and I'm on Instagram. I do a lot of little videos on Instagram. I really like doing that. It's easy for me. So here's some credit to the photos, because I always feel like we don't give enough credit to these beautiful photos. Crystal, Dawn, Laura, Swift Run Photography, Kate and Brad. And then some videos, Linda Black with Tegan, Ashley Johnson with B, who you just saw, and then my own dogs. Okay, it's time for questions. Let's do it.